Ba-ba-ba. Hello and welcome.
Hello.
Welcome, Courtney. We are getting ready to talk about Chapter 21, the Department of Commerce. This is my
The
excited face.
Department of Commerce.
This is an excellent example of Section 4, the economy, where there is a part of me that thought I would know nothing about any of the departments or agencies or any of those kind of things that are in this particular section. And then I did know some, but mostly did not know that that was inside that. And I don't know if you had a
Right.
similar experience, but Department of Commerce, let's go. Uh, First off, what are your thoughts on generally reading it? And were you at all surprised that we talked about Noah and space?
I was so very surprised that we talked about Noah and space. And I also feel a little bit embarrassed that I wasn't 100% certain until I read it that the census was part of the Department of Commerce.
Yeah, forgot
So
about that
I
one.
had to go kind of look some things up and found out that the Department of Commerce has only been around about 120-ish years.
It's a baby.
It's a baby. And that in the early 1900s, um, President Herbert Hoover, who was then the head of the Department of Commerce, really did some kind of kingdom building and got rid of some things that were in the Department of Commerce and brought some things into the Department of Commerce that he wanted to house there because he thought they were important. And that the Department of Commerce as it exists now is really um, largely based on some of his thoughts and feelings that brought those things into the Department of Commerce in the early 19 teens.
Perhaps we could
And
say
they've been
that
there ever
he
since.
hoovered them up.
He certainly did. Yeah, and he wasn't wrong about their importance. He wasn't. But it's interesting to see where those things are now and that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is there, as
Mhm.
is the census, as
And
is,
patents and trademarks, also
right?
also a thing.
And internet communication. I mean,
Yeah.
there's all kinds of stuff in there that I didn't expect to be there.
Well, so first off, thank you very much for probably, I'm not going to say out rabbit holing me, but the Hoover detail was a lovely, lovely little splash of salt that I love. All right, so let's take on commerce. So, one of the big things that I noticed at the top of the chapter was three main goals of basically the chapters seem to have kind of a similar baseline, right? Which is like dismantling while keeping it, while making it more efficient, while getting rid of it. Some might call that a contradiction, but not the Heritage Foundation. So, in the Department of Commerce, we are going to consolidate, eliminate, and privatize. That seems to be kind of the main super
Right.
functions of
Right.
their suggestions. Um, is that what you picked up as well? Is there something else that I missed?
No, I don't think so. I think that's pretty concise. And having consolidation is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if we can consolidate functions and make things run better, that's not a bad thing. Um, and I'm going to go so far as to say eliminating is not necessarily a bad thing if it's not something we need. If
Mhm.
it's something that's outdated that doesn't work, maybe we should eliminate it. But privatizing concerns me because when we pay our tax dollars to have the government administer things for us that we can't administer individually ourselves, either as individuals, communities, or states, then having the ability for public to oversee those and have government accountability because there is a requirement for transparency in government the way there's not in private, um, that makes me concerned.
Yeah. Also, who? I just want to constantly be asking, like, if you were to privatize any of these things, who is likely to get awarded those um opportunities, right? And so in we're getting
Right.
I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm like a million chapters in now. But when looking at big agreements of which privatized companies are getting which opportunities, etc., in those chapters, there's an argument that that's not fair. It's not fair competition. Okay, great. Um, one another thing I want to point out is we get another definition of who are we talking to? Who does the Department of Commerce serve? And in this chapter, it is workers, ranchers, and families. That is who the
Yeah.
Department of Commerce is serving. Workers, ranchers. So far, it is the first time the word rancher has shown up in the document, which I think is great. The people who work there are referred to as non-partisan civil servants to which are loyal to the president's agenda. So I again am going to invoke the Princess Bride in that you keep using this word, nonpartisan, and it does not mean what I think you think it means. Um, the idea of, we talked a little bit about this before we hit record, the idea of being independent and not politically aligned, but the prioritization of loyalty to the president's agenda, some would say is in conflict.
I think it would be hard not to say that they were in conflict when you talk about loyalty to an individual and then nonpartisanship in the same sentence. It's a little like jumbo shrimp and military intelligence.
I will add another one. I think you're making a very good point that is it's alarming, I think. But the idea of
Absolutely.
merit based, which if we're gonna do it, let's do it. But then that means there's outside transferable skills coming in to then be able to, let's go back to consolidate, eliminate, and prioritize. But if we're
Well, and I think
prioritizing
that that is
loyalty, that doesn't seem merit skills outside transferring in based. But
no, and the merit and skills um, is aligned with the nonpartisan nature of civil service because what you want is you want people who are competent and experienced and trained, and that you don't lose that level of competence and training and experience from administration to administration the way that you do with, like, I understand that the head of the Department of Commerce gets to be appointed by the president. That's fine. That's the way it's supposed to work. But for the most part, all of the people under him, the rank and file, those are the nonpartisan folks. That's where your experience and competence is gained. And it's gained over decades.
right.
And some of those people have spent their whole careers there. And that wealth of knowledge is so important so that the history, what did or didn't work, why we should or shouldn't try it again, um, where we were 10 or 15 years ago, or even 5 years ago, with how fast things are changing
Mhm.
with internet and AI. That history and experience and training is really important. And it would be really sad um, and detrimental to lose that if loyalty is prioritized over competency.
Yeah, there's a certain nuance that could very easily be duplicative, inefficient, and bureaucratic that is also rooted in history and knowledge and
Right.
understanding what's happening, right? So, if we go to, um, let's go to Noah, I guess, that's
Sure.
part of the chapter, right? So my personal favorite quote is, in being critical about Noah, is that they have the fatal conceit of planning for the unplannable. Isn't that basically called planning?
Well, it is in emergency services.
Right? Like we have to kind of guess. and then find
And we use the best data that we have, which is important,
right.
but we also have to say, knowing what the data is, here's the breadth of things that could happen. Do we have the resources that could be tasked to those eventualities should they happen?
Mhm.
Um,
Pattern,
and
patterns, forecasting,
sure, yeah,
educated guessing.
based in things like physics
Mhm.
and geology and
Yeah. See,
differential equations.
this is what happens when I'm greatly encouraged by actually reading it to also see my own fallible logic, right? Like I know that I'm being very charitable through this process, but when when using as an example of duplicated services, two different branches of NOAA, one of which that deals with salt water, one of which that deals with fresh water, it actually seems bureaucratic to me somewhere somebody has two different post-it notes, right? Freshwater issues, saltwater issues, same. Let's just make them the same department. And then also gut the employees. Right now, I do also want to call out that thus far, first time Native American needs and or domain over fisheries. First time that has been mentioned in what I have been reading so far. Fascinating. The fishery piece is almost a paragraph inside a couple pages around NOAA specifically. But then we get into space, which also slippery slopes into defense weapons and the digital divide and internet access. That shows up in some other chapters, but it's in there. Um, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which also includes the Census Bureau, um,
Right.
and how, again, if we're talking about, I'm using the quote, planning for the unplannable, the Census Bureau is a planning tool for the next 10 years. That's based on how our representative government is determined how many representatives that we get. GDP, consumer trends, consumer policy, consumer spending, those are all forecasted plans for the unplannable that we have to guess at. We
Right.
don't know about disasters, COVID, giant hurricanes, um, massive flooding nowhere near rivers. We don't know about any of those things. You are in Montana. It's 40 something degrees at the end of December. Um, those are unplannable events that can also be forecasted and guessed upon.
We have some indication that we're going to have warmer weather and colder weather. And when we get two things together, we also get wind, which
Mm.
is a wild, wild thing in our area.
Wind is amazing. Yeah, I do not live in Montana. I live on a cliff on the ocean, and the I am noticing fierceness of wind more than I'm noticing more rainfall. I don't even know if this is true, but I feel like the winds are much stronger, like Midwest representative winds, tornado
Right.
season representative winds. But here I see it visually more in king tides
Oh,
versus
what's a king tide?
extra super high or extra super low tides.
Oh, usually when the moon is full or when the moon is new,
Like the
right?
regular tide chart, but just exponentially bigger. And I am making a guess that it is something to do with wind. Could also have to do with earthquakes that are also plannable but unplannable, and whether or not it does or does not actually come with a tsunami. These are all words I didn't have to worry about growing up in Texas.
Right.
Right. All right, let's do a census because we mentioned it a little bit ago. What were your thoughts about the citizenship question being added in, even though the Supreme Court ruled that it was a violation? What are your thoughts about that?
I like simple and straightforward when things can be made simple and straightforward. And because there is a constitutional mandate to have a census, and it requires that everybody be counted, and in the Constitution, it even talks about that's where the three-fifths compromise is,
Mhm.
where at the time that the Constitution was implemented, slavery was a thing, and they made a decision only to count slaves as three-fifths of a person because they didn't want there to be more representation in the South based on the number of slaves versus the number of people in the North where there weren't slaves. And it feels a little like that three-fifths compromise, like somebody's putting their thumb on the scale in order to increase their power through representation or increase their influence through representation based on that count. And I don't think that the Constitution allows for a thumb on the scale. I think the Constitution is saying count everyone. And that number is important for lots of reasons, primarily in that part of the Constitution to determine representation. But we use that data for all kinds of things. You know, the citizenship question, the Supreme Court may have said that that's not okay, but they've said lots of other questions are okay.
Mhm.
And when we answer those census questionnaires, they're what, 6, 8, 10 pages long,
Right.
and that information all goes into a database someplace, and we all have access to it because it's a government function. Therefore, there's um, openness and accountability, so we can all get to that information for the most part, and we can use that information to calculate any number of things around needs for the population
Poverty,
because
homelessness.
right, it's the number that allows us to predict more effectively the needs that will arise. And so why do we need to put our thumb on data? I mean, just get the best data that you can have, and then you can use it for the things that it needs to be used for. And people are always going to try to manipulate data a little bit or try to use it to their own ends to a certain extent. And I think that as consumers in the world, and we're marketed to in so many ways in practically every instance that we're awake in the world now, we have some understanding that marketing might be beneficial to us, but it can also be used to manipulate us, and so we have to be savvy consumers. um, and it's that raw data that if we can go back to that and that raw data is accurate, then we can for ourselves make determinations about what we think about a particular issue based on what the population is, if the population is a question that informs the decision.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summary. It is interesting to me where I'm gonna say demographic data and privacy intersect, right? And so if we are a representative government, we need to know how many people are there. Now, spoiler alert, you already talked about three-fifths of enslaved people counting but not counting, which technically is also the history of the Electoral College of our popular vote counting but having a stopgap, right? So we have these stopgaps. This is not new. Don't get mad. But what is interesting to me, so like the race and ethnicity question, there is a suggestion of that just being removed entirely or conflated, whereas more democratic or more progressive things are actually adding options to be able to articulate more someone's racial or ethnic identity. Um, that I, okay, sure. The mean income, the number of people living in a house or at a given address, a tent encampment, etc. I think knowing around poverty and houselessness or homelessness can be really, really helpful. Um, Another chapter, I'm just inciting it here, is for in mentioning taxation or IRS kind of stuff is being able to actually track who has actual bank accounts, and knowing that someone has a bank account. To me, the way that if people had bank accounts and they're paying taxes and they're not citizens, that's also a way of identifying who is paying taxes, making money, spending money, who also is not a citizen. And having a citizenship question on the census that is also connected to an address and a name and things like this. It's more complicated than just a yes or no, because some people in the house may be, and some people in the house may not be, but you're answering per household. And my understanding, you're the lawyer, but my understanding of the reason why the Supreme Court ruled against a single question around citizenship is that the the household could potentially have a confliction in how to answer the question. Therefore, the question might not be answered in a way that mirrors what the census is recording of that family. And that is why it was thrown out. But I'm wondering if privacy versus knowing this actual information to then plan for the unplannable, what's the balance there, you think? And is privacy, is it privacy or is it something else? Remember, I was an art major.
Well, I think privacy goes to some of those individual decisions that are considered very important, but really nobody else's business.
Mhm.
Or, do you have kids? Do you want to have kids? How many kids do you want to have? Do you want to adopt them, or do you only want to have natural born children? Um, do you want to be identified in a particular way to other people? And demographic data is sort of sanitized in census reports.
Hmm.
It's how many people identify a particular way, whether it's male or female, Black, white, Native American, Hispanic, um, as they broaden those categories. But we don't then publish the data that says the household at 224 West Main Street has this many people identified this way and this many people identified that way. We just say that in the city of, there are this many folks at these age range identified in these ways. And so that demographic data is allowed privacy to the individual while still providing information that's useful for planning.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think there's a privacy aspect to it, but I also think that um, some of those questions are private. Some of the answers to those questions are private, and we ask people to answer them anyway because they're important, whether it's planning for how many kids are going to be going to school or young people going to college. Um, and it's how we report them that gives that element of privacy versus gathering the data in the first place.
That's
Um,
interesting. I remember the last census, there had been a possibility of a queer related question that I believe was not added. And then when the act of resistance, right, was that when we completed the census, the envelope that you put it in, allies, queer people, we decorated our envelopes in like colors and rainbows and things like that, so that as they were sent off and received, the idea was that the known population of like queer people or people who honor and respect queer rights would show up through the census. So it was decorating the outside of the envelope. Now, I don't know, but it seems logically possible that those envelopes were like fed through a machine and no one ever even saw the envelopes. It is possible that some volunteer somewhere or some, minimum wage worker somewhere is actually slicing open those envelopes and saw them all. But sometimes I think the nuance between what you're identifying of gathering the information and using it versus asking for the information and using it specifically for those people, the active resistance is also taking the moment to be declarative about what it is that you stand for or what it is that you believe in. Um, and I even think that I've had some friends who have worked as census collectors who have intentionally gone to tent encampments and homeless areas to make sure that their voices are being counted into the census.
Absolutely.
When when thinking about what to do or what not to do, I think it's important to kind of pay attention. There's a similar pattern in what I've understood is a lot of specifically younger women's fears of their menstruation cycles being tracked. So then in states that have much, much more aggressive anti-abortion legislation, that by
Yeah,
tracking when someone is menstruating, not menstruating, and menstruating again, I'm curious if that is a gathering data to plan for the unplannable, or if it feels more like an invasion of privacy because it could be linked to the individual. And technically, information can be used for nefarious reasons, and information can be used honoring someone's privacy and used as planning for the unplannable. But to me, my
absolutely.
brain connected those.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know there's a fear, particularly for young women, um, who are in places where access to um, family planning is limited or very tightly controlled, that they're afraid that if somebody had the right kind of data about them, they could force a pregnancy upon them.
Mhm.
And that's terrifying.
Yeah. I believe this may be an awkward transition, but we're going to go from that to economic development administrations. How is that for a transition? The Economic Development Administrations could be an office that gets cut because it is duplicative, and it could also stick around and focus primarily on rural energy, disaster and recovery funding, and what are being referred to as opportunity zones for if I cross over with broadband, internet cable distribution, cell phone towers. There's not a lot of call out for solar or wind energy because we're very pro fossil fuel use in this, obviously. But the jobs created to that, I think that is how more democratic initiatives are using rural energy and opportunity zones, and more conservative folks are doing more about transportation issues, moving fossil fuels, pipelines, things like that. Did you have any thoughts or comments about economic development and administrations, my friend in Montana?
Well, having been somebody who worked within a city government during a 500 or 1,000 year flood,
Yeah.
and having some of those dollars come in um, to help repair that damage for families, to repair internet access, cell towers, infrastructure, power lines that went across rivers, different things like that. Um, I think its function is, if not essential, very important. But where it lives, I don't think is terribly important as long as it continues to do the work that needs to be done, and that the people who are doing that work, that again, that um, nonpartisan, deep history and um, experience doesn't get lost, because those things inform the next emergency down the road, the next transition in a rural area down the road. What we've done in one demographic area that may have similarities to another different demographic area that needs help, whether it's rural Montana or rural Appalachia. If somebody's needing to improve cell towers or broadband access, those are real needs for those communities. So let's do the best job that we can. And when we lose that that bureaucracy, because it's not necessarily a bad word, when we lose that experience, then somebody's got to build it again.
Right.
And sometimes that creates innovation because they're new ideas. But generally, innovation is coming in because there's such a focus on data-driven analysis. It's required in the government. You've got to go in and look at the best data so that you can get the best answers.
Well, and that goes back to what you were saying at the top of the conversation too, is that those moments of innovation, if we combine it with privatization, um, could be really great business. And who is regulating? How much are things costing? Who's paying for this? And planning for the unplannable is also an entrepreneurial opportunity for local businesses versus people out of the area. There is a constant drumbeat in every chapter about China specifically. And if natural disasters or are turned over to private opportunities or private entrepreneurs to be able to fix or repair those particular pieces. For some reason, I just thought in my head when Puerto Rico yet again had another hurricane, and it was talking like there was a moment, do you remember this, where like Tesla was going to go in and restore all the energy in Puerto Rico, but they would own all of the energy used and produced in Puerto Rico. That was the agreement, right? If we're talking about the Department of Commerce, we also need to be talking about like how are the agreements that we have with other territories or other countries? What are they involved with? How are they actually being enforced or paid for? Can we do that in balance by also privatizing these opportunity zones? We haven't yet done it well.
Well, and I guess the other thing that, right, well, yeah, because the idea of privatization, it's not necessarily a bad idea, but private companies want to make a profit.
Mhm.
And government is not in the business of profit. It tries to build efficiency with competence, knowledge, and hopefully data-driven policies, but they're not in the business of making a profit. And
Workers'
I
rights
don't
are
blame
something that
private companies for that. I think that they have every right to make a profit. But when you then are privatizing an industry, a process, a department, one of the ways to make a profit is to reduce the number of people you are paying. And when you reduce the people that you're paying, the functions that those people were performing either don't get done or get done at a reduced level. And if it's a service to the public, I would hope that the public either sees that there's a need to reduce the level of service because it's not necessary, or that they see that there is an actual need for the service at that level and they resist a reduction because it's important to them that they get that service.
and I'm going to add one more layer in that because we are eradicating all conversations related to um my favorite way of doing this is extremist, leftist, Marxist, climate change agenda holders. Um, there are things that are going to be needed in places that did not currently experience that extreme weather or that particular kind of storm. That as things are shifting, flooding is going to be happening in places that are not used to flooding.
Yeah.
Big storms, big winds, big snows. I live in a very rural town on the edge of the continent, and I'm more afraid of mudslides than I am of flooding because the water has nowhere to go except into the ocean, right? Like it is going to go
Right.
downhill to the ocean, but the damage it's going to do in the meantime is not something I would normally have thought about. But that's
Right.
of being on the cliff. Um, so could be private, could be government, could potentially be outsourced to the state, right? But then we get into the complication of moving federal offices into kind of a net uh, across the different states. Some conservatives
Sure.
see that as being just taking bureaucracy and spreading it out thinner versus fixing the issue. Another piece that this chapter disagrees with itself, which I find fascinating, is the Minority Business Development Agency. This was one of my favorites. There was some commentary that this is some woke agenda piece benefiting primarily folks of color and women who own businesses. I would like to point out that veterans also are a classification of business owners that could be paid attention here, but it's not. Minority Business Development Agency, get rid of the whole thing. Or, speaking of numbers, uh, the dissenting voice recognizes that it was a very large number. I want to say it was like 60 something percent. I don't have the chapter open in front of me. Um, of commerce and entrepreneurial businesses fall under the category of minority businesses in the United States. And to eradicate paying attention to this kind of network would be detrimental to the privatization of commerce. So keep it, and then here you go. Are you ready? I wrote this down. Keep it in place, but its function should be focusing on policy versus services. So no more policy, right? Just services and education around evils of socialism and communism. Somehow that's supposed to be a service, not a policy. Destructive effect of taxes and regulation, also not a policy, but a service. It's paying attention to the destructive effect of taxes and regulations and unfair trade practices. So under the guise of services provided to and for minority business development agencies, we're going to focus on the evils of socialism and communism, destructive effect of taxes and regulation, and unfair trade practices, and probably with a nice little buttercream frosting of how China is bad. Then it could stay. To me, that is fascinating. Thoughts on that before we do patent and trademark office?
Well, I heard a statistic recently that really resonated with me, and that is um, 98% of businesses make less than $400,000 a year.
Mm,
And it makes sense to me when you're talking about 60 plus percent of those businesses
yeah.
being minority owned, when you include women and veterans as a minority, that in my mind probably pushes it above 60% pretty easily. That makes sense.
Mhm.
And those are the people who are doing 98% of the business in the country. Not by volume. I mean, we're talking not talking about Amazon, but those are the those are the folks that are employing the other local folks.
Right.
They're, promoting things in their community. They're the ones who are giving to the local charities and the local food banks. And those are the folks that are making a big difference in their own communities. And if there is an agency that's dedicated to helping them navigate, to helping them succeed. Wow. Let's keep that going.
Right.
Those people are important.
but recognizing the volume of the people, I don't believe needs to be that now you have access. You've got 60% of businesses in the United States on speed dial. So now let's put this particular social agenda down there. Now I say that as a pinko commie liberal, right? That like there are other the conservatives would see like environmental social responsibility as a political thing that's being shoved down people's throats. Um, if we are going to keep politics nonpartisan out of services that are supporting these businesses, um, the idea of being independent agencies is that it wouldn't be following a particular president's agenda, but the Heritage Foundation is asking for this to be in alignment with a conservative agenda. It is a conservative agenda. That's the whole point of it. It was also interesting to me, not only when you're talking, I had to know the less than 400,000, but that makes sense to me. When a different chapter, I was looking, or reading about the PPP and the EDIL loans during COVID. Its definition of a small business is less than 500 employees. That constitutes a small business. So I am self-employed. I have one employee, or which is me. I have 0 employees, right? Unless you count my dogs, but I don't even pay them a fair wage, so we don't talk about them. But the idea of how much my company would have to grow for me to employ 499 people and I would still be considered a small business, then that 60+% of the market share of private business in the United States also makes sense. That's a lot of businesses, and it really identifies the very small percentage that are large businesses that are really controlling commerce. Not just in the United States, but globally. All right, last one before we run out of time. US Patent Trademark Office.
Okay.
I hold a trademark. I went through the whole USPTO process, did it all by myself. It was not actually that hard or expensive, but I trademarked good enough now. And the idea here is to create and focus on strong intellectual property rights, support innovation, and there's an interesting balance there of kind of like made in America privatization, entrepreneurial innovation, and lack of better words, snapping up other things and saying mine, 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 mine. Like that's mine, that's mine, that's mine,
Yeah,
while encouraging other people to invent stuff.
this was one of those places where I thought the vagaries in their policy statements were problematic from a logistical perspective for what we're referring to as small businesses,
Mhm.
whether it's 500 employees or under $400,000. If somebody in that position has a patent or a trademark, how much of their capital can they afford to put towards defending that patent or trademark if somebody in China or Russia it is using it and then mass producing it and reselling it when the US local business is doing that on a local level, with US suppliers to the extent that that's possible, with US workers to the extent that that's possible. Are when they're talking about taking some of these protections away or um, opposing intellectual property waivers for cutting edge technologies, including vaccines. The healthcare industry, big pharma, is not big because it's a small business or that's where the innovation is happening. And they can afford to protect their patents and their trademarks, but a lot of folks cannot.
Mhm.
So, how is reducing or eliminating government assistance for that going to improve small businesses' ability to protect the intellectual property that they have?
Yeah.
That is true innovation that we talk about as Americans. Innovation being something that is um, appreciated, applauded. Um, I think that if the government's going to prioritize innovation, then they have to also prioritize protecting it, or helping people protect it.
Right.
When they're smart enough to invent something, but they don't have enough capital to defend the invention, there should be some help for that.
I totally agree with that. I also think, and I loved how you put it, is that this chapter does a very good job of me. I thought I knew a lot about the federal government. If I have learned anything in this project, there's a whole bunch of stuff I didn't think about. So where I was joking slash not joking earlier that like there's an entire department that does salt water and there's an entire department that does fresh water. Those are very different things that on a post-it note sound like they get smushed together, right? When you think about the census and you think about the Department of Labor and Statistics, oh, just smush those together. When in this particular case, the National Institute of Standard and Technology and the National Communications and Info Service, smash those together. Are we protecting spaces to actually support innovation while also slashing duplication and bureaucracy? I would like to say that there's probably a little bit of both, and I think we could do it well, but I think we need to use the skills and the experience that we have, and
Right.
that might look like a scalpel and not a bulldozer,
Right.
uh, because we're using these systems at the same time. So I had coffee this morning with someone. I was telling them about this project, and they're like, "You could just read fiction, like murder mysteries. They happen. Like, what are you doing?" And what I'm realizing is that number one, I'm not that person. But number two is that I am looking to understand what I can do better and to support something that needs to be changed. I also do not want to be a bulldozer. And maybe a scalpel is too small, right? So like maybe we need something in between a scalpel and a bulldozer. And I believe democracy is dependent on me doing my own homework and figuring out what is that idea. And perhaps that's innovation, perhaps that's planning for the unplanned, perhaps that's looking across history and finding out what did we do? It's all Hoover's fault. And looking forward to figure out what can we do is a hell of a lot better and a stronger position to be in than I have no idea the bulldozers are coming.
Absolutely. And also I think being inquisitive, curious, what kind of a bulldozer, what kind of a scalpel? Could we just use a hammer? Um, you know, and be continuing to ask why. Because if we can get the policies nailed down, because there's a difference between a policy statement or a policy objective and a policy. And does the policy that you're going to use get you to the policy objective? Are the nuances and the details of that policy informed by good data? And is the ultimate objective one that benefits many more people than it disadvantages?
Right. Policy and services. Those are the things that according to this chapter, we are trying to balance out in the Department of Commerce. Courtney, thank you for playing with me on chapter 21.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed this so much.
As
I look
always.
forward to seeing you again soon, and I'll check in with you on your good enough now afternoon podcasts. I've enjoyed them. I haven't gotten to see them all, but thank you, thank you, thank you.